The Hunted, Part 2, by TeeStache. Entry 5. 2 weeks before I met up with George, I received an SOS from one of my colleagues an hour after I finally tracked down the Ancient One. My personal vendetta felt more important. I abandoned them, yet their transponder never deactivated. After driving for 9 hours to get to the forests of South America, I finally came to a stop. The thickness of the forestry was too much to drive through. All I could do was walk through and follow the beacon to the last known location of my colleague. I had made my way through the forest for almost an hour before a freezing breeze brought me to my knees. Before I could react, a cold knife was being held against my throat. A familiar voice ordered me to drop my weapon. If I did that, I wouldn't be able to defend myself out here. The knife was slowly moved away from my throat. I turned around, a pair of amber eyes meeting mine. "You sure took your sweet time getting here." Her voice was full of irritation, with a hint of worry. "I'm sorry. I finally had a lead. I couldn't just let it go." My colleague, Arachne, stared at me with both disbelief and understanding, sighing before speaking again. "This way. If we hurry, we may be able to make it in time." I followed her down an unseen path she must have traversed several times. It was half an hour before we could see a concrete structure hidden by the trees surrounding it. It looked like a small garage, yet the door was too advanced. An illuminated keypad rested on the wall to the right of the stainless steel doors. We approached the building, making sure no one was around. I watched as Arachne pulled a severed hand from a bag. Strangely, the hand began to glow blue. The scent of something burning reached my nostrils. I watched as Arachne used the dismembered, glowing hand to punch a 5-digit code. Before I could ask her as to why, she simply said, "It would only accept certain fingerprints. I needed them more." I slightly smirked at that. Within seconds, the steel doors opened smoothly, revealing an elevator inside. Inside, I noticed there were 3 buttons. Reading the labels, there was one for the forest outside, one for the cell blocks, and one for experiments. Arachne clicked the third option. The doors closed quickly, and we descended down very quickly. The doors opened a minute later. A flawless titanium hall stood before us. We made our way as quietly as possible to the end of the hallway. A similar-looking scan pad rested on the side. Arachne took the hand and scanned it. An error message appeared, followed by a display saying, "Level 10 access required." She began to twitch and lose her cool. Before she could strike the keypad, I grabbed her arm, stopping her before she made things worse. She turned towards me, pain-filled tears falling down her face. Losing her fight, she fell and began to weep into my chest. I held her there for a while, letting her release her emotions. After some time, she finally sat up, wiping her face from her own tears. Before she could speak, the chime of the arriving elevator sounded. Before it arrived, we quickly sprinted towards the doors. They opened seconds after we stood to the side of the open doorway with our backs to the wall. An elderly man in a lab coat stepped out and began walking to the blast door. He didn't notice as we crept behind him. Arachne swung the butt of a knife. She collided her weapon with the back of his neck, while I caught the man before he could fall to the ground. We searched him for an ID, finding none. We dragged him to the keypad next to the blast door. Arachne took his hand and scanned it. The keypad read a new message. Level 20 clearance accepted. The blast door began to open smoothly. A blue glow escaped the opening, which began to become wider by the second. Arachne rushed forward once the door opened halfway. Dropping the scientist, I chased after her. A few meters ahead, a glowing blue tube of liquid stood. A figure floated within the glass structure, attached to wires and cords. Arachne was at the terminal to the side of it, typing a series of commands. As I got closer, I recognized the face of the floating individual. The strands of long white hair told me who he was. A few moments had passed before the glass in front of me slid open. I jumped back before the electrically charged water could touch me. The figure slid out of the tube, coughing his water-filled lungs out. Arachne approached him quickly, helping him to stand. I grabbed at the wiring and tore it off of him. As soon as the cord stopped touching him, all the lights cut out. A second later, red emergency lights illuminated the area, followed by a loud buzzer. I reached to help Arachne lift the man off the ground. Out of instinct, I reached for his left arm. I stopped when I realized Arachne was holding him by his only arm. His right leg was gone as well. His left leg remained. He had a scar from his right eye running down his face to his chin. Out of fear of time being lost, I stood in front of him. Before Arachne could protest, I threw him over my shoulders. "I'll keep up, just open the doors." The commotion woke up the scientist, now facing us with absolute fear. Before I could say anything, a bolt of electricity shot towards him. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed the man I was carrying had raised his arm to the scientist. Arachne ran to the charred body and cut off his hand, miraculously unharmed. I was a few steps behind her as she opened the elevator doors using the keypad. Once inside, she pressed the surface button. The doors closed, but we didn't move. "Let me try," the figure I held said. I walked to the buttons, wondering what may happen. A second later, the sound of many volts of electricity replaced the buzzing. We shot upwards, the force almost knocking me to my knees. Seconds later, the stainless doors opened. A strong gust of the forest wind scraped against my face. We all exited. Afterwards, Arachne threw a grenade inside the empty box. We left the area before it exploded. I carried him for a while before I spotted Arachne's truck. I opened the passenger door and set the man carefully inside. Turning to the driver's seat, Arachne was already in gear to leave. "I'll see you back at the base," she said with a slight smile. I watched as she drove away, to be sure she wasn't followed. After a couple hours, I finally found my own truck. Before I could open the door, I heard a loud snap. An instant later, my legs were bound and I was flung upwards. My face collided with my truck, causing me to slowly lose consciousness. Entry 6. I awoke around what felt like hours later. My vision was blurry. It took me a second to recognize my surroundings. I felt my wrists and ankles bound. I was inside a bamboo cage, wound tightly shut with chains. I was still inside the forest. My head throbbed with pain. I was startled to hear a voice I hadn't heard in years. "It looks like God has blessed us this day. Wouldn't you agree, Scotty?" An elderly man in an aged suit addressed me. "Long time no see, Preach. How long has it been? 6 years now?" 7 years, 4 months, and 8 days to be exact. I'm not going to ask how you've kept track of time. You mind telling me why I'm here? I pulled against the ropes binding me. Preach smiled at me with a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You are going to pay me back, finally." Rolling my eyes, I responded, "Look, if it's about money, I can go and collect it and airdrop it to you." He started laughing. "You do remember money doesn't do me any good. No, you must pay with blood. Unless you survive, that is." Survive what? His smile never left his face. You see, my boys haven't eaten in 2 days, and they're itching for some grub. We've cleared out these trees for all their offered bounties. That's it? Food? Yes, food. You are going to pay me back by being the next meal. My eyes grew wide with disgust at the suggestion. Now I'm willing to give you a fair chance. You have 1 hour for a head start. Leave these woods and your debt is paid in full. Get captured? Well, I'll let you figure that out. And if I refuse?
I'll open the cage right now and let my boys tear you apart and devour you raw.
I shuddered at the thought of being torn apart, screaming while in agony, wishing for it all to stop. Fine. Have it your way. What do I have to do? His grin never left his face.
I will give you 1 hour to escape, however you see fit. Find your truck, kill me or my boys. Get lost in these trees. Your choice.
I watched as Preach dangled a knife in front of the cage. He held it above and dropped it through one of the openings at the top of my cage. The blade landed into the rope binding my hands, severing it quickly.
Your hour begins now.
He turned and walked away. A few moments later, the sound of a motorcycle started and began to get further and further away. I worked quickly to free my legs. Within the cage, I couldn't stand fully. I analyzed the chains. They were discolored and covered in rust. Yet they were still iron. I couldn't hope to break them. I spent 15 minutes trying to ram through the cage. As you can guess, it was absolutely useless. They don't joke around with that stuff. I still have a knife, yet it wasn't my knife. Being too flimsy, the blade broke after I dragged a few strokes against the cage. Feeling defeated, I collapsed and leaned back. To my surprise, the cage began to move backwards. Before I could tell what was going on, I was rolling backwards for quite the distance. My vision began to blur as my blood rushed away from my head. My trip that felt like 10 minutes ended abruptly. I heard the sound of someone being hit suddenly, and the feeling of splinters of wood erupting around me. The world around spun a couple more times, then my body collided with the earth. My head still spinning, I lay for a few minutes. Feeling solid enough to walk, I stood up slowly. I looked behind me to see a very large bulbous man, unconscious on the ground, surrounded by shards of bamboo and chain links. A few yards away from him, another man of the same description was leaning against a trailer. Blood dripped from his forehead. A broken knife was sticking out of his temple. Stumbling over to the dead man, I searched him for anything I could use. From his corpse, I withdrew a Colt revolver with 6 bullets and a very familiar-looking locket. 2 cursive H's were engraved on the outside. Rage began to boil up inside me. The sounds of staring began to come from the once unconscious man. He sat up and looked at me. His eyes registered the corpse of the man who must have been his brother. A blind anger began to erupt from him as he charged at me. Out of instinct, I aimed the gun and fired it into his head twice. The momentum of his dash caused him to tumble and drag forward until he stopped right in front of me. The distant sound of a motorcycle engine stopped me from checking the second corpse. I hid behind the first of the 2 men for cover as I waited for Preach to arrive. He was carrying an irritated rant as he approached the camp.
Damn it, I told you to not waste any ammo. What were you 2 bozos shooting at now? A rat? You fired twice. How many times do I have to...
He stopped. After seeing the two bodies, I quickly stood up from my hiding spot, my gun trained on him. I approached him slowly, never taking my eyes off of him. Consider my debt paid in full. I shot him between the eyes, watching as his body collapsed along with the others. After searching the camp for a few minutes, the only other things I found useful were my truck keys, my hunting knife, and that strange communication device. It took a couple of hours of walking to finally find my truck. I had barely enough energy to drive back to base, yet somehow I managed. Entry 7. When I arrived, Arachne and her father were transported to our medical center. It would be some time before I would be working with her again. I went to the documentation station to report my findings. After a lengthy process of paperwork and signatures, I finally left to get some sleep. On the way, someone had grabbed my shoulder and threw me into the wall. My lack of sleep dulled my sense of urgency. Standing in front of me was the guy who threw me into the wall, looking down at me. He stood a good foot higher than I did, and had the pompous attitude to go with his stature.
You do realize it's a violation of the rules to take a job you haven't been assigned, let alone kill someone else's target.
I glared at him, ready to slam my knife into him. However, at this point, he would easily overpower my strength. I sighed and finally spoke back. Considering the unique situation I was placed in, I had no option but to take their life. He was about to attack me when we were both surprised by the announcement of me being summoned to the central office. I groaned in disagreement as I began heading away from blissful unconsciousness. Reaching the office, I was handed a report I found intriguing. A couple of hikers had been around an inactive volcano within the last couple weeks. They had brought their camera for scenery shots, but filmed something else instead. Our guys found them after they posted their findings online. We quickly deleted it and kept them quiet. We also took their camera off for evidence. Here's what we found on it. The video quality was a bit grainy, but that was due to the zoom being all the way in. Two figures stood inside of the volcano. The ground was dark grey, covered in dried ash. One of the two figures was very tall and heavily muscled. His skin was darker than the pitch of night. The second figure stood 1.5 feet below the larger of the two. The skin matched the ashiness of the ground they stood on, yet it looked as if cracks and red-orange ran along the entirety of their body. The audio was quiet due to the distance, yet roughly clear. They were discussing something that seemed important.
Why are you here, beast?
You know exactly why.
We've already tried this centuries ago. Look at me. Look at what you did to me.
The bright cracked seams along the second individual began to expand in length and opened slightly wider. He was growing agitated.
Leave me already. I can't help you.
I will not.
The camera began to shake violently. Cracks beneath the two figures began to spread across the dormant ground.
I warn you.
The last thing the camera recorded was the volcano beginning to erupt as the figures advanced towards each other. A pillar of escaping magma erupted, growing in width as seconds passed. I looked to my superior in confusion. He shrugged his shoulders and told me to figure it out. Having barely enough energy to walk, I finally made my way to my quarters to rest. My mind rattled with questions to what I saw. I didn't have the mental capacity to properly formulate them. They filled my head with disturbing dreams as I finally slept. Entry 8. It took a couple of days to update my superiors on my progress. I left my theories and personal reasons out of my report. only the facts and events that happened. When I described my meeting with the Punisher, they didn't so much as show any surprise. It seemed he was working with us and several other organizations to catch and kill his own kind. I remained silent about the transponder I was given. By the time I was finished and ready for my next mission, Arachne had returned from the medical center with a pleasant yet solemn look on her face. I approached her, giving her a genuine smile. She didn't react, so I tried my smolder. The corners of her lips tightened and rose just slightly. She rolled her eyes at me, yet I knew it had worked. "How is he?" "By official records, he is dead." Her voice lowered into a whisper, barely audible. "He was healed to what we could offer. They would have given him prosthetics, but he escaped." She sounded relieved after saying that. I couldn't imagine what else she was feeling, forced to hunt down her own father, while wanting him to stay alive as well. "I don't think he blames you." "You don't think at all. You still left me." She turned around and began to walk away. I grabbed her wrist, stopping her. "Let me make it up to you. Dinner?" The corners of her mouth tilted upwards again. She knew I noticed it. It was a week until we were given our next assignment. The path we followed to this point seemed random, unpredictable. No pattern could be seen. Our best bet would be to split up and head to major hotspots on subjects. The plan was to get ahead of the Ancient One and try to predict his moves. Arachne was sent to Chicago. I was sent to New York. We were to keep our superiors updated as to any changes that seemed suspicious. It would be the first time I'd go there. It never occurred to me big cities would serve as better cover than small towns. I left a couple hours later, packed with the gear I felt I needed. It took a few hours to reach the city. The plane touched down by the time the sun began to set. It was another 2 hours to get through traffic and find my hotel room. I felt restless. My mind kept wandering. I left the hotel for a late night walk to clear my head. It was a half hour before my body began to ache. It hadn't hurt like that for a while. The longer I walked, the more my pain increased. I started heading back to my hotel when my brain became overwhelmed. Holding my head in between my hands, I could barely hear as someone walked calmly towards me. I craned my head towards them. They were covered in a raincoat with a top hat. The man smiled down at me. He knelt down on one knee, reaching a hand towards me. Black and oily tendrils slithered from his coat sleeve, wrapping themselves around each of his fingers. Unable to fight back, I remained still. His hand reached my head. I could feel something like liquid wiggling into my ear, burrowing deeper and deeper. A few seconds later, the pain had stopped. I turned to the man, now holding a normal hand towards me. "Allow me to assist you. It seems we have much to discuss, Hunter."